Over the years, Scotland has seen its fair share of holidaymakers. Some come for the music and the entertainment, some because they're vaguely Scottish on their mother's side, but many come for the isolation, to head up north and get away from the world, to live for a few days, separate from the rest of humanity, and only surrounded by the beauty of nature. It will come as no surprise that those who frequent these trips tend to be writers, poets, philosophers, aiming to hone their craft and gain inspiration for their next project. But for one Englishman, his relaxing escape would turn into a close encounter with a man from another planet, the Lossiemouth incident. In February of 1954, a 32-year-old English ornithologist named Cedric Allingham headed to Scotland on a caravanning holiday. His route would take him from the Scottish border near Berwick all the way up the east coast to Wick, but due to a strange encounter of some note, he would never reach his final destination. En route to Wick, Mr Allingham had stopped at the seaside village of Lossiemouth. He planned to stay there for about a week, as it was the perfect place to indulge in some birdwatching. One day, while out on the Moray coastal trail between Lossiemouth and Buckie, Mr Allingham heard the sound of a strange engine overhead. When he looked up to the clear sky, he saw a small black speck high above him. Quickly retrieving his binoculars, he attempted a closer look at the object. He could see the sunlight reflecting from the surface, leading him to believe it was constructed of a metal material. To him it seemed to be some kind of craft. He estimated the height to over 5,000 feet. The top of the craft was dome-shaped and had some form of spherical landing gear. He dropped his binoculars and quickly retrieved his camera. The object began to move rapidly to the north. Mr Allingham took 3 pictures of the craft as it headed out to sea. Once the craft had left his sight, it took the man a few minutes to process what he had just witnessed. He could swear that the object was a flying saucer. Allingham continued with his day, looking for rare birds like the osprey. By the time he took a break at 3 PM, he had almost completely dismissed his earlier sighting, assuming he had mistaken some kind of aircraft for a strange UFO. Later in the day, around 4 PM, he began to head back to the caravan, retracing his steps in the hope that he could view the strange craft again. He didn't have long to go before the saucer-shaped craft returned. This time it was coming from the sea and heading straight towards him. A pang of fear and anxiety ran through the curious birdwatcher as he realised the craft was preparing to land. He was rooted to the spot with shock as the craft came within 100 yards of him, accompanied by a low bass hum. Mr Allingham took out his camera and was able to take multiple pictures of the craft as it made its graceful descent to the Moray coast. Later, Allingham would describe the craft in detail. He said as it landed, a loud audible thump could be heard, and the metallic surface of the craft seemed to radiate an unknown form of energy. It had a diameter of 50 feet and a height of 20, and at the top of the dome was a dark-coloured vertical rod, somewhat reminiscent of a lightning conductor. The spherical landing gear attached to the bottom of the hull was made from a soft material, similar to rubber. As Allingham moved closer to the craft, a large metal panel came away and lowered to the ground. What occurred next, Mr Allingham would never forget. A strange humanoid creature leapt from the craft and landed softly on the ground less than 6 feet from him. He stood there, staring in utter disbelief at the otherworldly traveller. The spaceman, as Allingham called him, was a 6-foot-tall humanoid with curious skin of a deep tan colour and a large, remarkably high forehead. But apart from that, the spaceman was not too dissimilar to Allingham himself. Later it was stated that in terrestrial clothes, the man from outer space could have passed for human. The alien humanoid wore a strange one-piece suit that covered him from the neck down. His head and hands were the only parts of the body that were left exposed to Earth's atmosphere. Transparent tubes ran from the creature's nose to his spacesuit and were assumed to be some form of breathing apparatus. Collecting his thoughts and suppressing his fear, Allingham wanted to question the creature. Quickly he rummaged through his pack and brought forth paper and a pencil. On the paper, Allingham drew a rough diagram of our solar system and held it to the spaceman, gesturing at Earth in an attempt to indicate where he was from. Then he pointed to Venus and pointed to the spaceman. In his utter amazement, the spaceman shook his head. Allingham returned to his drawing and once more pointed, but this time to Mars. At this, the spaceman began to nod furiously. It would seem it truly was a Martian. Allingham remembered other tales he had heard about alien creatures that could manifest telepathic abilities. Due to the limited information in his quick drawings, he attempted to communicate through his mind. He continued to repeat the thought, "Why have you come here?" but got no response. The Martian once again shook his head, as if he understood what Allingham was attempting, but did not possess those powers. Returning to his earlier method of communication, the Englishman began to draw a much larger picture of Mars. Over the next 30 minutes or so, many things would come to light. As Allingham drew the then mysterious lines on the surface of the red planet, the Martian seemed to recognise them. After much back and forth, it would seem that the lines on the surface of Mars were a form of canal used to store large quantities of water. It would seem that at some time in the past, Mars was a water-rich planet, similar to our Earth. One day long ago, the planet began to dry up, and over time, water as a resource became rarer and more valuable. Since that time, the Martian people have created technology which allows them to manufacture water, which is still kept in the old canals. It was also established that the Martian people had been in contact with the people from the planet Venus for many years, and that it was a combined effort between Venus and Mars that first sent a spacecraft to Earth. Mr. Allingham inquired as to why these two great races of spacemen would want to come to Earth. The chilling answer was that these other powers feared the warmongering nature of humanity, and were worried that if humanity began to explore off-planet, they would bring violence and destruction. The spaceman made it known that it was here to find a peaceful solution to the issues with humanity, and hoped that all three cultures could exist in harmony. With this, the spaceman turned to go back within his craft. Allingham presented him with a fountain pen as a gift from Earth, then snapped one final picture of the spaceman himself heading back to his craft. Within seconds, the large dome-shaped craft rose into the air without emitting any noise. It was only when it began to move north again that the distinct low bass hum returned. The saucer was gone, and Allingham continued to return to Lossiemouth. On the way, he pondered his extraordinary experience. He knew that he must tell people what had happened here today, but the story seemed so implausible that it was unlikely that anyone would believe him. It was then, from the corner of his eye, he spotted something else. Not too far down the path, there stood a Scotsman. The man's eyes were wide, his mouth open, and he was standing as still as a statue. When Allingham got closer, the Scotsman was shaken from his daze. It turned out that the man was called James Duncan. He was a local fisherman. He had been coming down the path and saw the last few minutes of Allingham's conversation with the spaceman. Knowing this to be just the vital evidence he required, Allingham persuaded Mr. Duncan to write and sign a statement, swearing to the truth of what he had seen that day. After his amazing encounter with the Martian, Allingham cut his holiday short and headed straight back to England in order to record the events. Later in the same year, Mr. Allingham would publish his account of that strange day in a book he called Flying Saucer from Mars. It was quite a popular book at the time and sold thousands of copies, but as with most extraordinary claims, there was more than a few skeptics. Many pointed to the similarities between Allingham's claim and that of George Adamski, an American who had claimed to meet and talk with alien beings on many occasions. In fact, Adamski had published a book on these claims less than a year earlier, called Flying Saucers Have Landed. The success of Adamski's book and the money he gained from its sale may have been the incentive which led to Allingham's extraordinary claims. Some thought that the pictures provided by Allingham also suggested a hoax. The science correspondent from the Sunday Express, a Mr. Robert Chapman, wrote that one picture showed the hazy back view of someone in the middle distance walking away from the camera, who admittedly might be a man from Mars, but could equally well have been a man from Margate. Mr. Chapman tried to track down Allingham for an interview but could get no response. However, he did find that a man claiming to be Allingham had given a lecture on UFOs to a local flying saucer club in Kent. Members of the club stated that they thought Allingham was telling the truth about his experience, but some of the conclusions that he had drawn from it may have been mistaken. Finally, Chapman reached out to the publisher of Allingham's book, Frederick Muller Limited. They told the reporter that Allingham would not be capable of participating in any interviews due to ill health. They stated that Allingham was suffering from tuberculosis and had gone to Switzerland in the hope of recovering. Sadly, this did not happen, and it was soon reported by the publisher that Mr. Allingham had died. After this, all leads in the case seemed to dry up. Chapman even tried looking for Mr. James Duncan, but could find no information on the man. 15 years later, in 1969, Robert Chapman would publish his own book named UFO Flying Saucers Over Britain. In this text, he left a scathing comment on Mr. Allingham and his encounter. Chapman wrote, "I am certain in my own mind that Cedric Allingham, if an author of that name ever really existed, did not have the experience he claimed, or anything like it. As for his death in Switzerland, I suggest this was no more than a device to put an end to inquiries for him. In my view, there's a strong likelihood that Cedric Allingham is still alive, in excellent health and far from repentant at having pulled a fast one on thousands of credulous saucerers." That was all there was of the story for a long time, until another theory came forward in early 1986, but that will be covered next week. In part 2, we look at the mystery surrounding the author of the book and delve in to the many theories surrounding this curious encounter. Thank you for listening.